Violence is often discussed as something that is an aberration from everyday life. So violence is seen to be exceptional. However, many critical theorists, particularly critical Marxist and feminist and queer scholars, have argued that violence is needed to sustain a social order. So I'll begin by discussing theories of violence, and in particular, I will make reference to Slavoj Žižek's text, Violence, Six Sideways Reflections. Then I will discuss Brandon Tina, the Brandon Tina Archive, Class and Space. And finally, I will discuss the Brandon Archive. I hope that you can access this lecture in an efficient manner. If there are problems with YouTube and copyright, I will send you the lecture using WeTransfer, or I'll post it on the university website. I can also just email it to everyone directly using WeTransfer if the files are large. So you will have a copy of the lecture for your university class. There are times when I think that if a university syllabus or a university class is about identity politics, or if a professor is somehow understood to be a representative of a group, which is something that Albert Meme, who is a post-colonial theorist, has called the mark of the plural, which is a theory of racism in which every person who is not white is thought to represent a them or a they or a group of people. So if this happens in the university curriculum, I think that there is some fantasy that this is not academic labor and that the classes are not academic or based on theory as they would be if it was a class, if I taught classes, or if there were classes that were taught that did not have anything to do with gender or race or sexuality. As soon as identity is thought to be a form of capital, then I think that intellectual labor is denied, and people somehow think that classes, university syllabuses designed by people with PhDs and postdocs are about some sort of community activism or representation, but this is a university class, and I do have a doctorate of philosophy. So the first point is about theories of violence. Slavoj Žižek's book, Violence, Six Sideways Reflections, discusses violence from the perspective of Marxist theory and also philosophy. Žižek draws a distinction between what he calls subjective violence and objective violence. Ultimately, Žižek claims that subjective forms of violence actually detract from public notices of objective forms of violence that are often caused by systemic issues. So subjective forms of violence would be something like police shooting. Objective forms of violence would be what well, I would argue a good example is from Albert Meme. So Albert Meme was a post-colonial theorist who argued that colonized people all bear the mark of the plural, meaning that whenever one speaks as a person of color, you are not speaking just with your own individual voice, but you are speaking on behalf of entire countries, entire continents. This also is about a lack of that individual legal rights and an acceptance, a kind of normalization, I guess is a good word, of low income status or poverty, because one is not thought to be an individual who can who can have access to individual earnings because of their education or labor, but part of an entire group of people who can all be thought to be people who comprise a certain class, irrespective of differences in education and work. So this is really about the mark of the plural and why colonized people are often constructed as a permanent underclass, in ways that are justified by really benign forms of violence, like the word community, or the word culture, rather than words like individualism, legal rights. So the very fact that people can think that an individual is not an individual, but is representative of an entire group of people is a really benign form of objective violence. Subjective violence is obviously something that we see, such as shooting, but the ways that language and identity function to normalize a lack of personhood and a lack of individual legal rights are objective forms of violence. This is a clip of Zizek discussing violence.
Again, welcome. We're very honored to have with us today a noted sociologist, philosopher, cultural critic, Slavoj Zizek. Slavoj is a senior researcher at the Institute of Sociology at the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia, a professor in the European Graduate School. He has been a visiting professor at several universities, including the University of Chicago, Columbia, Princeton, many others. And he's currently the international director of the Birbeck Institute for the Humanities.
So, I mean, you can compare this form of individualism to the idea of being part of a they or a community. So Slavoj Zizek is not Vidal Sassoon. Slavoj Zizek is not George Soros or Donald Trump. He is not every white man, and he is not every European man. So there is this idea of personhood that is automatically granted to somebody who is not associated with this mark of the plural. In other contexts, this might change depending upon what happens in Europe in the future. But there is this automatic idea of personhood, which I think is not ascribed to every body.
At Birbeck College in the University of London. The Wikipedian horde has deemed him an intellectual outsider and a confrontational maverick. And he comes to us today to discuss his recent book, Violence, a book which challenges us to look deeper into the topic of violence, to see beyond the ephemeral manifestations of violence, a gunshot, an explosion, the clash of metal on metal, bloodstains, and to discuss systemic violence, the violence inherent in our systems of living, our way of life. In a sense, our age is an age of the age of technological and biological exploration is an age of philosophical exploration as well. I know that many of us at Google are familiar with this. And to quote Slavoj himself, which I found on the internet, of course, the age of philosophy is in a sense, again, that we are confronted more and more often with philosophical problems in an everyday level. It is not just that you withdraw from daily life into a world of philosophical contemplation. On the contrary, you cannot find your way around daily life itself without answering certain philosophical questions. It is a unique time when everyone is, in a way, forced to be some kind of philosopher. So let's take this opportunity, please, for everyday philosophy and welcome Slavoj Zizek to Google.
I hope this works. Yeah. Thanks very much. I'm really glad of being here. You know why? Because let me begin with a funny association which came on my mind now. You know of what from my communist youth, this scene here now reminds me. Under communism, when I was young, you not only had to work in factories and so on, but you had so-called hours of ideological education, you know, like exactly like now, like during lunchtime, workers has to see to some boring short talk which ruined your lunch about, I don't know, great results of our construction of socialism and so on and so on. I feel like back in old time, we're sorry for ruining your lunch. So in contrast to the kindness of the good guy who introduced me, I would say, please don't let me terrorize you. If your mind is with your computer, go on, go on. I would feel bad about it. What I was thinking about what to do here. Of course, I don't want to give the resume of a book. I never was able to be so arrogant. Like I know some guys, poets and so on, who treat themselves as classics, you know, like they open their own book, read a paragraph and say, let's now look at what the thinker wanted to say. No, the proper dialectical way to approach this book is, I think, to do the opposite of the book, to focus not on violence, but on what violence reacts to, usually on the everyday texture of our lives, everyday ideology. Now, your first reaction probably would have been here, but aren't we beyond ideology? I mean, am I an old Marxist from, you know, like the species which basically died around 1990, who still believed in big causes and so on? No, I will try to convince you that ideology is, of course, not in the sense of big worldview vision to impose on society, but ideology in the sense of a whole complicated network of ethical, political, social, whatever prejudices, which even if we are unaware of them, still determines the way we function, is still something which structures our lives. What is ideology? Maybe some of you know this, but I cannot resist repeating this story because it works perfectly. Namely, do you remember, you must, my God, it was endlessly reproduced on Google, that unfortunate interview of Donald Rumsfeld some 5 years ago, just before the Gulf War, when he wanted to explain where is the danger of Saddam, and he used his famous parallel, he basically developed a whole theory of knowledge, claiming that there are, you remember, knowns, things we know that we know. Then, like, we know that Saddam is the boss of Iraq. Then he went on, there are known unknowns. There are things we know that we don't know. Like, for example, I don't know. I know there are some cars in front of this building, but I don't know how many there are. But I know that I don't know this, no? Then he went on, there are unknown unknowns, in the sense of things that we even don't know that we don't know them. Like his idea was, the unknown was how many and where Saddam has his weapons of mass destruction. Like, we don't know, but we know that we don't know. But then his paranoia was, what if there are unknown unknowns, some secret weapons that we don't even know what they are? Get it? They're more radically unknown. Now, my claim is that, okay, that was his idea. My joke here is that if you have a little bit of a sense for structural analysis thinking, you see immediately that something is missing here, a fourth term. Known knowns, we know what we know. Known unknowns, we know what we don't know. Or then unknown unknowns, the totally other. Like, we don't even know what we don't know. Something is missing, the most interesting category. Not the unknown, not the known unknowns, but the unknown knowns. Not think we know that we don't know, but things we don't know that we know. That's the unconscious, that's ideology. All those silent prejudices which determine how we act, how we react, And we, in a way, they are so much the texture into which we are embedded that we literally don't even know that we know them. And I think this was why you were in such a trouble in Iraq. Not so much that there was some mystery that you didn't know. The US Army and administration basically didn't know what they already know. All the unconscious political, military prejudices, as it were, which determined their activity. Which is why, I don't know if some of you know it or not, to give you another example, I'm sorry of repeating myself, I hope you're a new public here. The analysis, because of which, and again, it was mocked endlessly in Google, it brought me some negative fame, but I still think it works perfectly, of this unknown knowns is the structure of toilets in our Western civilization. It's ideology at its purest. I will say, am I crazy? Where is ideology? Did you notice something? I simplified the analysis, but I know I simplified, but basically it holds, I claim. What do we get? We have we get three basic types of toilets. The French one, where, sorry for relative vulgarity, where the hole is in the back of the toilet so that shit falls directly into the hole and disappears. I mean, not the hole, I mean, not just the bowl, but the hole where then, get it. Then we have the German type where the hole where the shit disappears is in front. So that the shit is somehow displayed there. You know, Germans have all this ritual of, I'm not kidding, around 50% of toilets, check-it up, if you go to Germany, are still structured like this, that the sheet is displayed there and they have this old ritual. Every morning you should smell your sheet, check it for traces of, I mean, Erika Young in her Fear of Flying makes a wonderful comment. She said, she writes, a nation which had such toilets, no wonder they imagined Auschwitz and all the horrors. Okay, then you have the Anglo-Saxon, American and so on, toilets, which are mixed. It's not, doesn't matter where the hole is because it's all full of water so that the sheet floats freely there. Now, I was always intrigued by this. I asked my friends, architects in one of the other country, why this? And they tried to give me utilitarian answers. Like German said, isn't it natural to inspect your sheet? French said, sheet smells, let's get rid of it. Americans and Englishmen said, let's be practical, it should float in water so that it doesn't smell and so on. But obviously, it's not purely a utilitarian level. Then I ask myself a simple question. Where did I already hear this trinity? Let's call it a French, German, English, Anglo-Saxon civilization. Do you know that already 200 years ago, there was around Hegel's and French Revolution time, there was this popular idea among philosophers and so on about so-called European Trinity, claiming that the spiritual backbone or fundamental structure of Europe is composed of these three nations. Each of the three stands for a certain political principle and for a certain sphere of society. Germans are politically conservative, and sphere of society privilege there is Germans are a nation of poets, thinkers, and so on. Culture. France is revolutionary, and the preferred political sphere is politics. Anglo-Saxon universe is more, how to call it, liberal, centrist, utilitarian. The political sphere is economy. And then I got it. That's it. That's the key. French revolutionary, shit disappear, liquidated as soon as possible. You Anglo-Saxon, more pragmatic, floated there, let's see how it's a Italian approach. Germans, metaphysical and poets, reflected and so on, conservative. And then I spoke with architects and they admitted it, crazy as it may sound. That's the only way to ultimately account for a totally vulgar object like the concrete structure of a toilet. You see now my point, which is slightly more serious, not only a tasteless joke, that even to account for the most elementary vulgar object, how it is structured, the whole, I wouldn't say worldview, but basic attitude towards civilization and so on, it's not just a utilitarian object. This is what interests me, this type of ideology. Ideology which is all this set of cultural and so on prejudices which structure our daily lives. And you don't even have to be fully aware of them, especially today in our so-called cynical era, where very interesting things are happening. How do we deal with ideology today? Maybe you know it, it's also endlessly in Google, the wonderful anecdote about Niels Bohr, you know, Copenhagen, the quantum physics guy. The story is a wonderful one. The story is that once a friend visited him in Denmark, in the countryside where he had a house or go there to weekend, whatever. And the friend, also a scientist, saw above the entrance a horseshoe. I don't know how it is here, but in Europe, horseshoe above the entrance door is a sign of, it's a superstitious item destined to prevent evil spirits to enter the house. So the shocked friend asked him, wait a minute, are you crazy? Why do you have this here? Do you believe in it? Aren't you a scientist? Niels Bohr answered him, my God, I'm not crazy, I'm a scientist. Of course, I don't believe in this shit. Then the friend asked him, if you don't believe in it, why do you have it there? Ah, he gave a wonderful answer, Niels Bohr. He said, of course, I don't believe in it, but I have it there because I was told that it works even if you don't believe in it. That's how ideology functions today. We are all cynics, who believes what and so on. But we somehow rely on it that it will work even if you don't believe in it. How should I put it? We, in this sense, we live in a cynical era, not cynical in the usual sense, bad people manipulating, but in much more refined way. We practice beliefs without believing in them, as it were. And this is what fascinates me in ideology, especially today. The old image of ideology was you have some explicit beliefs and then privately you let it know, oh, I'm not crazy as that and so on. Today it's the opposite. What was once private is now public and vice versa. Privately, we like to play that we are not crazy to believe in some stupid ideology. We just, what is ideology today, explicitly? I think some kind of a vaguely Dalai Lama spiritualized hedonism, no? It's no longer do this, sacrifice yourself, in spite of what Republicans are saying. They just react to it. Basically, ideology today is some kind of a vague injunction. Be truly yourself. Realize your potentials or whatever, and so on and so on. But I claim we believe much more than we appear to believe. We obey, or whichever way you put it, much more than we appear to do. And this, again, is what all this tension between, let me call it, explicit beliefs or absence of beliefs, and this cobweb of, to put it in the terms of your great philosopher Donald Rumsfeld, of the unknown knowns, this is the crucial dimension. At the end, I hope I will have time, I would really like to mention briefly even the whole Sarah Palin phenomenon. I think is, you cannot understand it without, not toilets, let's forget that, but it will, because, sorry. Okay, let me go a little bit further here. Did you notice another extremely interesting phenomenon about which I've written and which points in the same direction? What my friend, Austrian philosopher Robert Faller, you can Google him to be tasteless. You know, I will endlessly repeat this joke being here, at least on the German Google. You find him. He proposed a wonderful category of interpassivity. The idea is that it's not only that we like, in what we philosophers call cunning of reason, that we like manipulate others. So you sit back, others are active for you. Robert Faller drew attention to a much more mysterious phenomenon, opposite one, of what he calls interpassivity, where we transpose onto the other our passive reaction. Others are passive for us. The most elementary phenomenon, and I love it. I think this is arguably the greatest contribution of American civilization to world cultural heritage. Canned laughter on TV, you know, when just think about it. It's a much more mysterious phenomenon than it may appear. It's not, as some wrong Pavlovian psychologists think the function of you hearing the laughter there as part of the soundtrack is not automatically to trigger your laughter. No, it works so that literally the TV set laughs for you. At least that's how it works with me. I look, it's really the same thing as, you remember those, I always like them, in Tibetan Buddhism, those praying wheels or meals and so on, where you write down a prayer, you turn it around, or even better, you let the wind turn it around, and then you can masturbate, whatever, it doesn't matter. Objectively, you pray. You pray through it. Here it's the same. It lasts for you. That's my experience. You know, in the evening, you arrive home, that tired, you put on some stupid show with canned laughter on TV, cheers, friends, whatever, and you don't even laugh. The mystery is admitted. At the end of the show, you feel relieved as if you have laughed. That's the mystery, how it works. And my thesis, back to Donald Trump's topic, is that it's the same with beliefs. It's not so much that we believe. We need, as it were, another one to believe for us. This is how our rituals function. For example, take Santa Claus. I mean, of course, nobody believes. I mean, parents, if you ask parents, they say, no, we are not crazy. We pretend to believe not to disappoint our children. But I can guarantee you, if you ask them, the children, they said, no, I'm not crazy. We pretend to believe not to disappoint our parents and to get presents and so on. You got the point. Nobody has to believe. Only if every individual actually existing presupposes another agency to believe, then belief functions. The whole system of belief functions. The first to use this structure consciously, politically, it's, you know, the old Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir, who, when asked, do you believe in God? Of course, she didn't. I mean, that's the irony. Israel, who makes his claim of the West Bank like God gave us this land, is, and I like it for that, avoid a misunderstanding, is the most atheist country in the world. According to statistics that I read there, about between 60 and 70% of the Israeli Jews don't believe in God. And the irony is that, so Golda Meir was asked this. Her answer was, no, I don't believe in God. No, she didn't answer. She just answered, I believe in Jewish people and Jewish people believe in God. But the point is that there are no individual Jews who have really to believe in God. Everybody just has to evoke this specter. And so the most terrifying experience is when you learn, not that you don't believe, but that the other, which was in a way the guarantor of your belief, doesn't believe. If you know a little bit of literature, that's so shocking. You remember Age of Innocence, Edith Wharton. At the end, the guy, okay, I speak in cinema terms, Daniel Day-Lewis, is told by his son that Winona Ryder, his dead wife, knew all the time about his affair with Michelle Pfeiffer, but pretended not to know. When he learns it, everything is ruined. That's, I think, our much more fundamental need than directly to believe. To have another one as protected innocence. So let me go on a little bit here after we return to ideology, to explicit ideology. How do these prejudices function? They're something much more complex than it may appear. Recently, 3 months, 2 ago, I gave a talk at Harvard. At the end of the talk, we were invited, you know, this is the most boring part of academic meetings, where we had an official dinner where, you know, people who are really bored by each other, you have to pretend and so on. So the older professor who was coordinating dinner, 10 of us, said, okay, since we don't know each other well, please, can everybody here present him or herself? State your name, position, state your work, field of interest, and your sexual orientation. Now, this shocked me a little bit. For my European sensitivity, like, my idea was almost, you know, like, what's none of your business, no? But now I don't want to play the vulgar American bashing, because, you know, this bar of discretion is just different in Europe. Immediately, I remembered how a friend of mine visited me, not the previous summer in Europe, and we went to the Slovene coast, where Slovenia, we were already under communism, sexually, culturally, a very liberal country. So as in most of Europe in the last 20 years, most of the women were simply with naked breasts, no bra on the beach. It's considered totally normal. Nobody even notices it. Here, I'm told it's not so normal. Like I was told, you can even get arrested or what. And typically, that friend of mine, leftist, liberal, whatever you want, felt oppressed, almost harassed, aggressed, totally traumatized. So you see, here we have a nice difference. And again, I think that the formula, which is closer to me, I don't think discretion means oppression, is the proper attitude is the one, maybe you know the anecdote, Gore Vidal, your writer, gave the best formula of discretion. He's a well-known bisexual. He was asked in a TV interview some years ago, was your first sexual experience with a man or with a woman? You know what was his answer? I was too polite to ask.
So I'll stop it there. The topic of the lecture is about violence, and I'll specifically discuss the Brandon Tina case and Halberstam's writing about the Brandon Tina case and transphobia. There's a lot to be said about Zizek's writings about violence, and when I post the PowerPoint slides online, you can watch the entire lecture, and there are so many interesting philosophical and theoretical points. The idea of canned laughter, where we are all participating in something and yet we know it is a ruse. And also the point that Zizek makes about doing things for others, the Santa Claus points that parents are aware that Santa Claus does not exist, but they continue to engage in these rituals for their children, I think is similar to gender in this time period. That if you were to ask people if they believe that there are fundamentally huge differences in every aspect of someone's life because of gender, or that the mind is completely different because of gender, or the kinds of labor that someone can do are different because of gender, or even access to healthcare and life expectancy are different because of gender, they would probably say no. And yet we still continue to behave as though gender exists, and we often engage in these rituals. And there have been a lot of debates specifically about parenting. And if we compare gender to Santa Claus, we can ask why people continue to raise children in these ways that are so gendered, knowing that later on in life, all of these norms around different colors for different genders of children, or different patterns of behavior, being nice or being not nice, depending on gender, or caring about science and not caring about science because of gender, will not necessarily matter for adults. So I will leave you with the lecture to watch on your own, the full clip when I post the slides online. We'll move on to discuss Brandon Tina, class and space, and I will make reference to Zizek's theories of subjective and objective violence when considering the subjective violence of cases like the murder of Brandon Tina, as opposed to the objective violence of gender and gendering, which I will argue is never separate from capitalism and from divisions between the public and the private, who is thought to be the economic earner or the quote unquote breadwinner, as opposed to who is thought to exist within the private realm. And these are gendered power relations that Marxist feminist thinkers have also discussed at length. And I will discuss Nancy Fraser's work as well in other lectures. So this is a clip of Halberstam discussing gender. And in future lectures, I'll talk about Nancy Fraser's work about Marxist feminism, and I will discuss Marxism in great detail and what it means today, or what I think it means today in relation to the feminist movement and the queer movement, and also anti-racism. And I also discuss Marxism and what I think it means in contemporary India, particularly in this political time period in relation to debates that are being had about Muslim women in education and women in education overall.
The term trans bodies refers to the changing nature of gender in an era when large numbers of people are making changes to their bodies, either using hormones or using surgeries, or simply changing their gender pronoun or their name. And this has reached a certain critical pitch of intensity to the point where we now have to rethink what we mean by gender. And so I'm using the term trans asterisk to refer to the multiple ways in which the gendered body has changed, certainly over the last 50 years, but in an intense way over the last decade. The reception of this increasing number of trans bodies in public spaces has put pressure on the ways in which we only recognize gender in the form of a binary. So we think that a body that is not male is female, and a body that is not female is male. And I think especially among young people, that binary just doesn't hold anymore. And you see that there are many different inflections and nuances to gender identity. So the crisis, the spatial crisis that this has created has to do with what, I called a long time ago the bathroom problem, which is where a social subject, is in a public space and is faced with a choice, the men's room or the women's room, and there's no other option. And so because of the wide range of gendered expressions, restrooms, toilets, public bathrooms have become overloaded in a way. The crisis around the bathroom is a reflection of a larger crisis in relationship to the gendered body. It's a very easily resolved crisis, quite honestly, because bathrooms are making a division between types of bodies that basically is no longer relevant, male, female. It's not, there aren't enough choices. So all you have to do is in any given space, have a number of gender neutral bathrooms. And what you find is in spaces where there are gender neutral bathrooms, most people use the gender neutral bathroom. So it turns out that this seemingly natural division between male and female is a division that is anachronistic. It does not do the work that it used to do. In fact, it confuses the way in which people understand gender. There is a question as to what happens to heterosexuality when so many other forms of social gender, sexual identity are shifting and changing. Is it possible that heterosexuality simply stays the same? And no, it's not possible. One of the things that I've argued in my work is that when there are shifts and changes in one part of the culture in relationship to sexuality and gender, it has a ripple effect, and that changes everything in the culture. So if there are more trans people, then the binary gender form upon which heteronormativity depends is destabilized. And when it's destabilized, when it's no longer so clear who is a woman and who is a man, obviously heterosexuality is also thrown into some kind of doubt. When marriage is not so central, reproduction, it does not require married monogamous relationships. What is the meaning of heterosexuality is a very good question. Well, you never know if heterosexuality is changing. That doesn't necessarily guarantee any particular outcome. It doesn't mean that, oh, this is the end of gender or this is the end of the family, but it is the end of any kind of presumed, inevitable, organic, natural relationship between men, women, marriage, babies, family life. That was an unquestioned paradigm, even as recently as a decade and a half ago. Now it's not an inevitable paradigm. And I think for young people, the trajectory of their lives is more unclear, more unpredictable, less tethered to family, marriage, and reproduction than it was. And this is a good thing because it opens up questions for people about what is my life to be, whereas heteronormativity always closed down questions. It was a script in advance. So I think this is, in many ways, it's a good thing for heterosexuals. Regardless of what happens for LGBT people, this is good for heterosexuals. And this is something we never talk about, the way in which normativity is, disciplines and punishes LGBT people, but it also constrains and confines heterosexual people. So by focusing upon the imposition of heteronormativity on heterosexual people, you see that many of these rigid norms are not good, not just for minorities, but for the majority of the society. And this is why they are destabilized now, because this is not a moment when young people definitively want to simply get married, have children, have a family. Nowadays, most marriages end in divorce. In the US, it's some 65% of all marriages end in divorce. So at that point, you'd have to say that divorce is usual. Divorce is, in fact, expected. That means that then marriage is not what we used to mean by marriage, right? Marriage used to mean for life, till death us do part. Now it doesn't. Now it means for this amount of time. So similarly, we have to rethink what we mean by marriage. And I think it's into that moment of crisis that, gay marriage was able to exploit the uncertainty around the cultural meaning of marriage in order to, have these legal opening to gay marriage. Gay marriage in and of itself is not a very radical thing, but it is an indicator of some shift, some fundamental shift in the way in which we're thinking about the relationships between intimacy, sex, companionship, reproduction, and family. These things have shifted irrevocably. So we're in a moment where the architecture of power and its relationship to the body is shifting and changing. We don't know exactly what that will mean 10 years from now because things change so rapidly. But what we do know is that we are living with paradigms that are not the paradigms we were living with even 5 years ago. And that the change is rapid and overwhelming and definitive. You can't go back. So what is the future? We have to look around. We're already in that future. Election of Donald Trump has had all kinds of effects in the US to do with the, dwindling faith in democracy and sense that the political process doesn't work, and clearly shift in the understanding of what decency means or the way in which relationships between men and women should be conducted. But it's also about the ascent of a certain kind of white supremacy that now has become normalized and inscribed into everyday political life. That said, LGBT groups are not the target of Donald Trump. It's not clear. He's not a cultural conservative. He is more of a right-wing racist, and as long as there are white LGBT people who find benefit in some of the policies that Trump champions, he also receives support of some LGBT people. 14% of LGBT people voted for Trump. That doesn't sound like much, but that's actually a pretty significant number of probably mostly white men who felt that it would be financially good for them to vote for somebody who was going to, lower taxes. But there are also lots of gays and lesbians who, like Trump, think that Islam is a big problem for them and that allowing Muslim immigrants into the country is going to produce new forms of homophobia. That's honestly how some white gay lesbian people think. It's the same in Europe, in Holland and in other places. There have been intersections between anti-immigrant movements and pro-LGBT movements. That same nexus is operating in the US and means that it's not so obvious that Trump is anti-gay or that LGBT people are anti-Trump. So this is a moment to abandon identity politics and think in terms of new forms of solidarity around the issues where there is obvious danger and precarity in terms of the new reality that Trump is creating.
So that is Halberstam, and Halberstam's reading is part of the syllabus, and it is a chapter from
The term trans
sorry,
bodies.
it's a chapter from their book called The Brandon Archive, and this is Halberstam's book, In a Queer Time and Place, Transgender Bodies, Subcultural Lives. I think what is interesting, there are a lot of interesting things to consider about the entire chapter and about Halberstam's discussion about normativity and what it means overall for society. That ideas of gender normativity and the family are changing, and that divorce is now much more normalized and the meaning of marriage has changed. I think for the purposes of this lecture, what I will discuss are the ways in which narratives are told about gender and about life and death. And following from Zizek, what I would argue is that the subjective violence of, say, a murder of someone like Brandon Tina, who was killed, who was a queer person who was murdered in the United States of America, is seen to be subjectively violent and shocking. But the ways the story is told and how a story is narrated are part of a wider set of objectively violent power relations that are often not questioned. So if we think about the election of Donald Trump to the position of President of the United States of America in relation to these anti-immigrant movements, and also the ways that homo-nationalism, which is a term that was created by Jasper Puar, arises, and migrants and people of color are thought to be necessarily homophobic, we can think about the election of Donald Trump as leading to these alliances in the global north, where people who have right-wing capitalist interests attack migrants as being homophobic or as being sexist in a way to justify their own economic interests in the United States of America. So that being, say, an American or being a North American and having a certain accent and passport become important and allow one to participate in a conservative right-wing capitalist version of America. You could also think about what the election of Donald Trump to the position of President of the United States of America, and what also other right-wing leadership in other states that still exists, and right-wing leadership that could be elected in Canada, means from the perspective of feminists in the global north. I mean, in the global south, sorry. People I know who work for NGOs in India were really terrified about the rise of right-wing politics, because it means that a lot of funding for NGOs that offer women in India and queer people in India information about contraception, abortion, sex, and safe sex are going to be cut. So a lot of the funding that comes from the United States of America or comes from Canada is obviously under threat immediately if there's right-wing leadership. So more than just being about words, the election of conservative leadership is really about numbers and about aid funding and specific aid funding to NGOs that give young people information about sex ed that their parents might not provide them with. So you can think about necropolitics and the politics of who lives and who dies. In its most extreme articulation, I think conservative right-wing politics in global north countries is really about sentencing certain people to die. Because not only would someone argue that certain people shouldn't immigrate and maybe brown people shouldn't immigrate, but they would further the argument that no aid should be given, particularly regarding sex education and abortion and other forms of aid that would mean that someone could live somewhere in some country in the world. So it is rather chilling if you think about how economic policy is really about who lives and who dies. And this is, I think, also true of Brandon Teena. Halberstam writes, the tragic facts in the case of the murder of Brandon Teena and his two friends are as follows. On December 31st, 1993, 3 young people were shot to death, execution style, in Falls City in rural Nebraska. Ordinarily, this story would have evoked only mild interest from mainstream America and a few questions about the specific brutalities of rural America. One of the 3 victims, however, was a young white person who had been born a woman, but who was living as a man and had been dating local girls. The other 2 victims, Brandon's friend Lisa Lambert and her friend Philip Devine, a disabled African-American man, appeared to have been killed because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, although this too is debatable. So Halberstam discusses the ways that the murder of Brandon Teena and Lisa and Philip cannot be divorced from wider white supremacist politics in the United States. They write, it is hard to detach the murder of Philip from the history of Neeson, and Neeson was one of the people accused in this case. So it is hard to detach the murder of Philip from the history of Neeson's involvement in white supremacist cults. Many accounts of white power movements in the United States connect them to small all-white towns in the Midwest and to economically disadvantaged white populations. While one would not want to demonize poor white rural Americans as any more bigoted than urban or suburban white yuppie populations in the US, it is nonetheless important to highlight the particular fears and paranoia that take shape in rural all-white populations. Fear of the government, fear of the United Nations, and fear of Jews, Blacks, and queers mark rural masculinities in ways that can easily produce cultures of hate, writes Halberstam. In small towns where few people of color live, difference may be marked and remarked in relation to gender variance rather than racial diversity. As Newitz and Ray point out in their anatomy of white trash, some degree of specificity is necessary when we try to describe the identity different and when we try to describe and identify different forms of homophobia and transphobia as they are distributed across different geographies. So Halberstam is interested in the ways that urban geographies and rural geographies are very different and how archives are constructed about hate crimes against queer people. And this is really a story then about class and the ways that class divides and interests in power relations and interests in capital allow one to tell stories in different ways. So the murder of Lisa, Philip, and Brandon is really about a set of power relations in a rural town. And when the narrative reaches other storytellers and other filmmakers and other audiences, the story of Brandon Tina becomes a singular instance. It isn't the story of three friends, a woman, someone who transgressed gender binaries, who was a rural queer person, and a Black disabled man who were all killed together. And what Halberstam is interested in is how this kind of urbanization of queer life is really used to obscure the workings of race and class in rural America, which cannot be understood from an urban middle class lens, or cannot be fully understood. So Halberstam writes, our relations to place, like our relations to people, are studded with bias, riven with contradictions, and complicated by opaque emotional responses. So the idea of where, this location or this theorization of place and urban geographies, I think is an important way of thinking about violence. Halberstam further states, I believe that an extensive analysis of the Brandon murders can serve to frame the many questions about identification, responsibility, class, regionality, and race that trouble queer communities today. Not only does Brandon represent a martyr lost in the struggle for transgender rights to the brutal perpetrators of rural heteromasculine violences, Brandon also serves as a marker for a particular set of late 20th century cultural anxieties about place, space, locality, and metropolitanism. Fittingly, Brandon has become the name for gender variance, for fear of transphobic and homophobic punishment. Brandon also embodies the desire directed at non-normative masculinities. Brandon represents other rural lives, undone by fear and loathing. And his story also symbolizes an urban fantasy of homophobic violence as essentially Midwestern. But violence, wherever we may find it, marks different conflictual relations in different sites, and homicide, on some level, always depicts the micro-realities of other battles displaced from the abstract to the tragically material. While at least one use of any Brandon Tina project must be to connect Brandon's gender presentation to other counter-narratives of gender realness, I also hope that Brandon's story can be a vehicle linked to the discussions of globalization, transnational sexualities, geography, and queer migration. So the idea of place, I think, is important if you think about class stratification and what happens when people do things in small towns and small working class towns that would be normal in cities. And I think that this happens more and more in Canada and in places like Ontario. Many people cannot afford to live in major cities like Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto, and they live in small towns because that is where they can afford to live. And these patterns of violence then are really about trying to stake claim to a certain place and a certain way of life in a certain place. So questions about place, I would argue, are also always about time and thinking about how one constructs a traditional way of life in a certain place. And this way of life and this relationship to time is always contested by people who want to live in, or who want to practice, who want to behave in certain ways in rural places, and who would argue that times have changed, even in rural places. The changing of time is also about the passage of law. So the research that I've done about India is about Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, which was struck down on September 6, 2018 in India after a Supreme Court ruling made it legal to be queer. And this was after many years of petitions and the ways that time changes and the ways that places then have to change, I think, is about upholding the law throughout a country, irrespective of class divides, that rural places are often places where people can afford to live. And every country, major cities are some of the most expensive places that people live. So upholding the law in rural places, I think, is extremely important. This is also true of other legal precedents like abortion rights and rape law. So Brandon's relationships with local girls, I think, caused a great deal of anxiety in this rural town. And the case can be thought of in many ways, and it can be thought of also in relation to the rights of women who live in rural places to have access to legal rights. So this is a recording of the trailer for the film Boys Don't Cry. which was released many years ago, and it is a mainstream depiction of the Brandon Tina case and the murder of Brandon and Lisa and Philip.
Before all this.
So you're a boy. Now what?
You want the truth, don't you? No. That was a long time ago. Got your mother in the world, 'cause she's not sure if you're a boy or a girl.
Why don't you leave the lady alone? I don't want any trouble here.
You gotta be kidding me.
Oh.
You can't just keep running forever.
Nothing can go wrong if we're together.
What are you saying, him?
You wouldn't even believe it.
Something's totally weird. What's going on?
I'm just looking out for you.
We can just beam ourselves out there.
He's got her brainwashed.
Had a dream about you last night.
Are you or are you not?
So what are you gonna tell him? I'm gonna tell him what we know is true.
So it's interesting to think about what happens when laws are passed. The LGBTQ movement, and specifically transgender rights, but also I would argue in the context of India, the queer rights movement has really been about law. In the last 10 years, I mean, there isn't any one queer rights movement, but a lot of the media debate and a lot of the things that have garnered a lot of public attention and a lot of the NGO funding has been connected to law. And so I would argue that the law, on the one hand, makes certain lives legible and intelligible globally. It also allows for one to make claims against employers and educators and parents and the state in order to seek financial compensation and also restraining orders against abusers. But what the law also does is to create category. And what Halberstam discusses in their book, In a Queer Time and Place, are the ways that there are a lot of different gender roles that are articulated in subversive ways in rural places by virtue of the fact that rural people are often engaged in things like farm labor or are not bourgeois enough to really play out these Victorian colonial roles. And I think this is also true in India. So Halberstam discusses farm boys and so Farm Boys is this volume, or it's an oral history project. And they write one account of gay life in the Midwest that records the combination of privilege and oppression that characterizes the lives of the white gay men who lived there can be found in an oral history project called Farm Boys. In this volume, historian Will Fellows collected the memories and testimonials of a group of Midwestern gay men. And Halberstam goes on to discuss the ways that gender roles are different in rural places because of labor and because of because of access to income as well. So they state that a masculine woman in the context of a farm is not automatically read as a lesbian. She is simply a hardworking woman who can take care of herself and her farm. Farm masculinities for men and women then result in an asymmetrical development of gay and lesbian identities in terms of their relations to gender inversion models of sexual identity. So the law then creates categories, but the law is not the same as labor, and it isn't the same as having a relationship to place. So India is a country of farmers and it's a country of rural villages. I mean, it's hard to make a definitive statement about such a large subcontinent, but there are a lot of rural articulations of gender that already subvert gender norms before legal categories in English and in courts of law. So the ways that one enacts gender is perhaps about class and about place and about labor, as much as it is about categorization in language and law. The death of Brandon Tina then and the violence they experienced, I think, is about histories of white supremacy and hate crimes in certain places. It is not just about categorization, and it really is something that perhaps can be thought of in relation to legal rights for queer people, but I don't know if the language of legal rights will ever stop histories of hate crime in certain places. So the research I did about India was specifically about a gang rape case, and it was about the gang rape and murder of Jyoti Singh, who was killed on a bus in Delhi. And Jyoti Singh was not an affluent woman. And the treatment of women in Delhi, which is the capital of India, I think can never be separate from the ways that queer rights exist for some but not for others because of how normalized violence is against women and how gender roles are upheld, particularly if in certain areas. So while gender might be different and rural people might engage in farm labor that allows women to appear more masculine, I would argue that this isn't the same as having an openly queer relationship. So these power relations then are always slipping. One might meet somebody in a rural town who engages in a lot of labor that is not very feminine or bourgeoisie, but when it comes to the family, there is a certain mode of humanness that one often gains by enacting performatives of family values that allow one to participate in a wider national narrative of the United States of America and also of countries like India. So I would argue that rural places are really interesting to think about in relation to contestations about gender. And there were a lot of ideological debates that happened in these rural towns regarding Brandon Tina's relationship with women. I think that queer politics and the politics of violence itself, and also any social movements cannot, should always perhaps, or should perhaps think about women and the ways that anxieties about what women do, the amount of money that women earn, what women look like, are always about ideology. It's interesting to think as well about what happens when people refuse, when people do not fit into certain categories. As soon as there is a name that is ascribed to something, there is also often a place. Halberstam writes, while Brandon fits only nominally into the category of, quote, woman, and while his complex story cannot be called, quote, lesbian, Brandon's choices do give us some insight into what kinds of options may exist for cross-identified, female-born, transgender people in rural settings. Many urban gays, lesbians, and transgender people responded to the murder of Brandon with a "what do you expect" attitude, as if brutality was an inevitable consequence of trying to pull off such a risky endeavor as passing for male in some godforsaken place. But what such a response ignores is the fact that Brandon had been passing for male with only mixed success in the city of Lincoln, Nebraska, since his early teenage years. Indeed, it was only when he left the city and made a reverse migration to the small town of Falls City that he really pulled off a credible presentation as male. Obviously, the small town can accommodate some performances, even as it is a dangerous place for others. For example, an exhibition of normative masculinity in a transgender man may go unnoticed, while an overt and public demonstration of non-normative gendering may be severely and frequently punished. Urban responses to Brandon's decisions also misunderstand completely the appeal of the small town to certain subjects. Like Sylvie Hess, the West Virginian in Stewart's ethnography, who remembers the loss of a favorite animal and the beauty of the place of its death side by side. The rural queer may be attracted to the small town for precisely those reasons that make it seem uninhabitable to the urban queer. Brandon clearly knew what was possible in Falls City, Nebraska, and he seemed to know what limits might be imposed on his passing performance. He moved to Falls City not in order to be a stranger with no history, but because he had friends there. This idea, too, of having friends in a rural town and of rural masculinity is also not a story of that is really puritanical or cleansed of these elements of violence. So the film and the archive of Brandon Tina the film with Hilary Swank and Chloe Sveni in it often really depicts what it means to have friends in a rural town, and it isn't necessarily innocent. These relationships are about rural masculinity, which is not innocent, and it isn't necessarily without the sense of deviance and risk-taking. I would argue that queer politics in countries outside the global north are also not innocent and involve a lot of political activism that is really oppositional and can sometimes be quite violent and volatile. In the book, 6 Degrees of Separation, which is about feminist jurisprudence in India, Farah Naqvi writes, "What does it mean to turn grief into grievance?" And I'll put the proper reference on the PowerPoint when I post the slides online. What does it mean to turn grief into grievance? And the author is really interested in the relationship between the law and the feminist movement. And they argue that the feminist movement, and I think the queer movement as well, and any social movements always have a really fraught relationship with the law. Because grievance is a set of claims. It can never fully contain grief, which is a messy emotion. Ultimately, the Brandon Archive is not simply the true story of a young queer misfit in rural America. It is also a necessarily incomplete and ever-expanding record of how we select our heroes, as well as how we commemorate our dead. The cowardice of this time and place, this era, is nowhere more clearly revealed than in the perpetual attempt to make the public and social disaster the result or the issue of a single demented creature, writes James Baldwin. The idea of the demented creature or a disaster is also about this kind of cleanliness of telling narratives that are not about sex and they're not about desire. And the Brandon Archive is a story of rural masculinity. It's also a story that is about desire, and I would argue that desire is never something that can be contained by neat columns and categories and by a language of innocence. The stories we collect in the Brandon Archive should stretch far beyond the usual tales of love and hate and the various narratives of accommodation. This archive lends us precisely the kind of evidence for things not seen that Baldwin sought. And in the end, if we read it right, it may tell us a different story about late 20th century desire, race, and geography. So the late author Bell Hooks wrote an essay called Eating the Other, and Bell Hooks' essay was really about the messiness of desire and race in America. And I would argue that the Brandon Tina story is also about this messiness. The power to narrate Brandon Tina's story is also about the power to be a legal subject. And I think that the Brandon narrative in the archive is interesting to think of in relation to the law and who sees themselves as someone who would make legal claims as opposed to who is afraid of the law. The author of Crime writes James Baldwin, is what he is. But he who collaborates is doomed forever in that unimaginable and yet very common condition, which we weakly call hell. One may also discover, writes Halberstam, that while the brutalization of a transgender sex worker of color raises little outcry in the city from local queer activists, the murder of a white boy in rural North America can stir up an enormous activist response that is itself symbolic of these other imaginary divisions. So this idea of the law, I think, is really interesting. And the research that I have done in India, or that I tried to do in India, was about hijras. And hijras might be referred to as transgender women in English language discourse. And their relationship to law as category is not the same as one's relationship to law when they are a poor person. And I think that the Brandon Archive is really interesting in thinking about how people try to turn a story into one of innocence, and one in which marginalized people are always victims of law, rather than people who might have been afraid of the criminal justice system. So I'll finish with this quote by Arundhati Roy. Sometimes I think the world is divided into those who have a comfortable relationship with power and those who have a naturally adversarial relationship with power. So we can think about how middle classness is sometimes an effort to turn marginal identity into a story of victimization, and a story of someone who has legal rights, rather than thinking about marginalization or marginal identity as being a story in which a story of people who don't have a lot of money and might not want to be involved in court cases or might fear the police. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. So if Marx is right, Karl Marx, and the ruling ideology is created by the ruling class, then we can ask whether laws are just part of what ruling class people create to serve their own ideological interests, or whether the law and the criminal justice system ever really exists for poor people or working class people who might actually fear police, as we've discussed in other lectures. Okay, that's it, and I hope you enjoyed the lecture and it gave you something to think about. Thank you.